Well, good evening, everybody, and this is going to be the first roundtable court. We are joined by Tony, aka Sleeping Warrior, and the Rumpus, and Tony has brought the Rumpus here to court on a charge claiming scales are a force measuring device, but being in contradiction by his own science. Now then, we're going to try something a little bit different here. In this particular case, I'm going to try my best to keep these guys from killing each other, so to speak, and launching into a debate with each other, because I don't want it to be a debate. I want it to just be a question and answer session, essentially, but in a courtroom style format. So, without further ado, Rumpus and Tony, are you both there?
Yeah.
Okay, so Tony, you've summoned the Rumpus to court. Do you want to go through your opening statement as to why you have brought the Rumpus here? Go ahead.
All right. If you screen share, Ranty, can you see my screen?
Go ahead.
Okay, so in Jose's chat recently, I heard a guy come in and he was on the fence. He was quite new to the discussion. He wasn't sure. He was basically asking inquisitive questions. He was new. And Rumpus jumped up and he basically asked him, do you agree that scales are a force measuring device? And the guy thought about it for a couple of seconds and he said, yes. And then a conversation ensued. And it dawned on me that that's a bit of a contradictory statement, because on the one hand, if scales are a force measuring device, he's in contradiction. He's in contradiction by his own science, and that's what I realised that was a contradiction in itself. So I thought, well, when you suggested that there would be a back and forth that was uninterrupted, I thought, well, I could make my case against the Rumpus and point out to him that he's in contradiction by his own science, and ask him to address the claim, hence the reason why the charge has been brought before the court today. So my claim, and I'll be really clear, is that Rumpus claims that scales are a force measuring device, but the science, his own science, is not supporting him with that, and he stands in a state of contradiction by his own science. So let's have a look at the meaning of the word force. To avoid the accusation that I've cherry-picked, I've just got 3 on screen. You can look these definitions up anywhere. They're all over the place. They all say roughly the same kind of thing. A noun, strength or energy as an attribute of physical action or movement. The meaning of force from the physics classroom says a force is a push or a pull on an object resulting from the object's interaction with another object. In this case, it would be an object with the scales. Whenever there is an interaction between an object and scales, there is a force upon each of the objects. And a third point says, in science, force is the push or a pull on an object with mass that causes it to change velocity. Newton described how force works mathematically. In nature, fundamental forces are gravity, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, etc. So basically, we can conclude that the definition of force is basically an interaction, a push, or a pull. So Rumpus also claims that mass is not a force, but weight is a force. And on face value, when you look into the definitions for weight and mass, he seems to be supported on face value. He's got weight as defined as a body's relative mass, giving rise to a downward force, and then mass is, by way of contrast, is not considered a force because it's everywhere. You can look up these definitions, and I'm not cherry picking. You can look them up yourself, and you can see that it's everywhere. Mass is not a force. Weight is a force. So on the face of it, Rumpus seems to be supported. He seems to be having the definitions correct. However, we know that Einstein states, and bear in mind he is the current citation for gravity, his theory of general relativity has been in place since 1915 and is still considered to be the current science. He says, and again, you can fact check yourself, you can look into it, just go onto Google and type in is gravity a force, and you will find everywhere gravity is not a force, it's the effect of the curvature of space-time, and in this instance from physics.info, caused by the presence of mass energy. The problem is that if gravity is not a force and Einstein's the current citation, his theory of general relativity, if gravity's not a force, but also mass is not a force, only weight's a force, what force is being exerted on the scales if it's not gravity or mass? Because as Rumpus rightly points out, mass is not a force, weight is a force, and weight, the only difference between weight and mass is little g. Well, Einstein says that little g is not a force, so it can't be a force on the scales. But if mass isn't a force and little g is not a force, then what are the scales actually measuring? Because there is something being measured on the scales, and we know by the definition of force that if there's an interaction, a push or a pull on an object between another object's interaction, in this case scales, there's got to be a force. So there's got to be a force on the scales, right? But we know it's not mass because mass is not a force. We know that weight's not a force either because little g is not the gravitational attraction of the Earth. That's not a force. But something is on the scales, and the only thing that's left really is mass. So one of three statements is one of these has to be true, but you can't have all three of these being true. So one of them's true. Either the scales are measuring mass as a force, because little g is not a force, or the scales are not actually a force measuring device as preached by the Rumpus, or Einstein was wrong according to the Rumpus, and gravity is actually pulling down on the mass after all. But them three statements are not all true. There's only one of them that's true. And I don't know which one's true. I just know that all three of them can't be true. So one of them's true, but I don't know which one. And Rumpus does appear to be in a state of contradiction. Rumpus is in violation of the law of non-contradiction, because one of them three is true. Law of non-contradiction states that it's a contradictory proposition. It states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true. In this case, all three of them can't all be true in the same sense at the same time. The law is employed in a reductio ad absurdum proof. And that's what's happened here. We've got it reduced back to the basics, where if scales are actually a force measuring device, then one of them three sentences is true. Albert Einstein is wrong about his theory of general relativity, or mass must be a force because there is something being measured, or scales aren't measuring a force at all. And I don't know which one it is, but my assertion is that Rumpus is in a state of contradiction with his current science, because Rumpus thinks that mass is not a force, weight is a force, and something really is measuring on there. So what is the force that the scales are measuring if it's not mass? And it can't be weight because that's not a force. But something's on the scales. So my question is, Rumpus, are you in a state of contradiction by your own current science? Or can you tell me what actually is the force that's on the scales? Let me guess, he's going to respond with, I don't understand something, or I'm really stupid in some way. But I'll relinquish the rest of my time over to Rumpus. I'm done.
Okay, Rumpus, would you like to respond to that, please?
Okay. I'll share my screen. Well, what am I doing here? Oops. Right. Can you see my screen?
We can, yeah.
Right. Okay. Right. Why is that not? Right. So, Anthony's proposing there are three things: the scales not being a force measuring device, mass is what's being measured, or Einstein is wrong. Well, Einstein is right, but the word gravity is misused. Well, the word gravity has several definitions. One, we can talk about gravity as in the bending of space-time, and we can also talk about gravity as being the force of gravity, where gravity is the bending of space-time. Just like many other words, it has multiple meanings, and we should really be using it in the same sense as electrostatics. So, for instance, there is the science of electrostatics, and we talk about an electrostatic force. But electrostatics is not a force. Electrostatics is the umbrella term to describe everything to do with positive and negative charges, and part of that is the force of attraction between them. So we talk about electrostatics and the electrostatic force. And gravity is rather similar, except for the fact that people including myself, have used the word gravity to refer to the force of gravity. So really, the definition, because this thing called the bending of space-time, this 4D stuff, that is what Einstein's referring to when he talks about gravity, and that's what most theoretical physicists refer to as gravity. But they will then also talk about the force of gravity, which is the manifestation, because remember, that's all happening in 4 dimensions, three of time, three of space, and 1 of time. And then that's 4 dimensions, space-time, 4D space-time. And then we have our 3D world, which doesn't have a time dimension. We've just moved along by it. And so there are some quotes we got of people. I mean, Anthony's claiming that Einstein said that gravity is not a force. I don't think he's ever actually said that. But anyway, here are some other people. George Musser, in a famous hangout people may be aware of, that he had with Fight the Flat Earth. And so here are a couple of quotes from it. This is Fight the Flat Earth said, gravity is the warping of space-time by mass. He's basically offering a definition. Gravity is the warping of space-time by mass, which changes the locality of things, which manifests within physics that we can measure as an accelerating force. Musser said, yeah, I think that's pretty good. Later on, he says, we must think of Newtonian gravity as a force. And later on, he says, use force concept. You're perfectly entitled to speak of gravity as a force when you're working through with implications, when you're working through why things fall. This is a literal translation, so that's why the word literal transcript, that's why it's a little bit weird. When you're working why things fall, why things move, and they're in the way that they do, okay, when it's only when you start to get into the deep questions, and those are the ones, of course, I was dealing with in that particular article. He's referring to an article about scientific comparison. Another article, I think that's I'm perfectly happy to describe, and I do describe gravity as a force, as I do describe electrical forces. So they're doing the same with electrical forces. You have electricity, and part of that are the electrical forces, which is exactly what I was talking about electrostatics. So there we have George Musser, who writes articles on general relativity and is editor of the part of the Scientific American. And then we have someone called Jolyn Bloomfield, which Anthony's had some contact with, who's wrote a web page that Anthony refers to occasionally as being on his side. And at the bottom of the page, he says, so to summarize, general relativity says that matter bends space-time, and the effect of that bending of space-time is to create a generalized kind of force that acts on objects. He also had something to say about Anthony, saying, I disengaged with him because he was a crackpot who was misconstruing everything I wrote. I've had communications with him. Right, so force, weight, and mass. Let's get this sorted. So here we have the Earth, and here we have a person on it, and there is an attractive force determined by... So we've established that the theoretical physicists agree there is a force of gravity in our world. It's not... The force of gravity in our 3D world is a force, but not in the 4D world. That's the bending of space-time. So it's moderately complicated. One word, 2 meanings, and we've got this 4D, 3D different environments, which we sort of have to shift between. And the 4D one, we can justify the existence of this 4D world with other reasons, which I won't go into. So a person is attracted to, this is Newton's law, and this can be derived from Einstein's equations. So Einstein actually said he was perfectly happy with Newton, and using the Einstein field equations, which I don't have here, but which are incredibly complicated, they actually reduce in the simplified cases where you're not near a very massive body or you're not moving very quickly to the Newtonian laws, and it has the same units. So it actually reduces to a force the Einstein equations. So he couldn't disagree with Newton because his equations reduced to the Newtonian equations in the case of the sort of everyday world that we live in. And so here is the Newton's famous universal law of gravitation. You can see it as big G, not little g. The 2 masses, the mass of the Earth, I haven't written down here, so the mass of the person here and the mass of the Earth, the product of those 2 things divided by the distance between them, between the centre of masses. So this would be the radius there, or the distance between the person and the centre of the Earth would be just the radius of the surface of the Earth. I haven't written that in, I haven't had time, unfortunately. And so on the surface of the Earth, the 3 parts of this equation, the G, the M2, so the M1 of the Earth and the R squared, actually combines to come up with a value of 9.81 meters per second squared, which we call little g. So there's a constant in here because on the surface of the Earth, big G doesn't change, the mass of the Earth doesn't change, and your distance from the center of the Earth doesn't change. And that actually ends up being 9.81. So we can simplify this formula on the software. We don't have to use the lunar variable, just simply call it little g. So we can just simply multiply the mass, which was m2, the mass of the person. I'm sorry, I haven't written it in, times this little g, which has the units of acceleration. So we can say that the force being caused to acting on a person is their mass times little g, which is acceleration. And we refer to this force, the force exerted by the Earth on a person, as your weight. And that has a vector, as you can see here. It's directed towards the center of the Earth. It has direction. It has magnitude. Right. So let's just deal with right. And so here we have, this is a person. Little g is an acceleration. Acceleration, just like velocity, has direction. And here I've put this person on some scales. Now the mass m is not a vector. It's what's called a scalar. That means it just has magnitude. It has no direction. It just simply is a value. And it's very important to note here that weight is the result of two factors. The weight here, F, is your weight. It's a force. And it's the result of your mass times little g. If you don't have one or the other, you don't have a force of your weight. So you've got to have both. And so on the scales over here, we can see that the scales, there is only one way to actually interact with the scales. There's no magnetic interaction, no electrical interaction, but we can see that the device in it has springs and things which only respond to forces. And we can actually obviously push with our hands on some scales and get a force. So we know that it is a force measuring device. And we can see that the only way a person can interact with it is through forces, mechanical forces, the pressing of a person upon the scale surface. So the force of gravity is providing that force. It is a force measuring device, and it returns you the force. It returns you its weight. So the question is then, another question is, what happens in space if we take this situation of the person, move them into space and put them on the scales? What is the force that this scales would register? So, actually over here, the mass is an intrinsic property of matter. An object's mass does not vary depending on where it is, what it's doing, how fast it's going, what it's interacting with. Its mass is an intrinsic property, whereas its weight is, as we've seen via this equation, which is dependent on a number of things. Now, this is the full equation here, because obviously we've come away from Earth here, we're in space. And we can see if this equation here, if there is no other body to attract, although obviously in this case we've actually got some scales which have mass, but it's assuming that's not relevant, it's so small we're going to ignore it, that there is no m1 anymore. So the result of this equation is 0. So that means that the force will be 0. And in space, in this situation, it will actually show you nothing. Similarly, when you're in the vomit comet, because you've removed little g, this little g here effectively becomes 0 because you are moving along with it. So it's not accelerating, your whole body's accelerating. That also reduces to 0. You do not have any weight, in effect, in that environment of the vomit comet. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because in the other reference frame of the Earth, you do. But fundamentally in space here, your weight would be 0. Your mass is still exactly what it was before. So then the question is, what is mass? Well, mass is what we can regard as your inertial mass, which is your resistance to acceleration, a force. Sorry, it's the resistance to a force. How quickly do you accelerate? So if you use the Newton's second law, F is equal to ma, you can rearrange this formula and say that the mass of an object, you can work out if you apply a force to it and you divide by the acceleration with which it responds, you've worked out its mass. So here we have in space a bus, which I'm applying a test force to, and it responds with a particular acceleration, which would be quite slow. If I was pushing on it, for instance, this would be quite slow. But if I was to push a test force, my hand, I could apply somehow to the ball, that would accelerate much more quickly. And that ratio of the force to the acceleration is what its mass is. That's an intrinsic property. So, okay, that's stuff I don't know go into. Right, so the people who worry about these sorts of things say there is a force of gravity. I've demonstrated what mass is. I've demonstrated how scales work. And so the problem is indeed that Anthony doesn't understand, because it's slightly complicated, and that's always too much for a flatty. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. As predicted, Tony was correct. You did say that. So, right, what we're going to do now, seeing as it's Tony or the Flat Earther that's taken yourself, Rumpus, to court, we're going to stick you in the dock there, Rumpus. And Tony, so you can start your questioning now. Fire away, the Rumpus. If you can, please try to answer as concisely and honestly as you possibly can. Thank you.
I always do.
Go ahead, Tony.
So the accusation or the allegation is that you appear to be in a state of contradiction by your own science, and you've just presented a document where, if you could turn to the page that you had the definition of F equals ma on. I think it's the one above the one that that one there. Just hold. You were on it then. It was just you were. That one there. Right. Just hang on. A person is attracted to Earth by the force of gravity as given by Newton's universal law of gravitation. A couple of points about this. You've got big G as the universal gravitational constant.
Yeah.
In the formula for F equals mg, you've got little g. What does the little g stand?
Right, as I didn't make it out. I didn't have time, but it actually equates to this times this divided by that. As I stated here, this g is this g me mass of the Earth divided by r squared. That equates to little g. That's where we get little g from. It's that value constant, the universal gravitational constant times the mass of the Earth divided by the radius of the Earth, because we do all our measurements on the surface of the Earth. So if you weren't on the surface of the Earth, this wouldn't be a constant. It's sorry, I thought I was about to do something naughty there. So that's why this is a constant for something. If you were to go much higher up, much further away from the Earth, or would you go, for instance, if you were to somehow be able to burrow down to halfway towards the centre of the Earth, this would not, little g would change. It's only a constant because you're that particular distance away from the centre of the Earth.
Okay, forgive me. Maybe I didn't ask the question that I was meant to ask. You've answered a different question to what I actually thought I asked. Underneath, you've got the capital F equals mg.
Oh, right here, yeah.
And then you've got underneath it says where m is the mass of the person or the object, and g is the acceleration due to gravity.
Yeah.
Acceleration is a force, isn't it?
No, it's not a force. Acceleration is the rate of change of velocity.
Yeah, but to make a mass move, it's part of the equation for force, isn't it? It needs the mass to move for it to be a force.
Oh, I didn't understand that question.
You've got the mass.
Can you rephrase the question, Tony?
This is the mass. Force is equal to mass times acceleration is Newton's second law.
Yes.
That's what you're referring to.
Yeah. So you've got the mass, and for that mass to be subject to a force, it must accelerate. Agreed?
Well, no, the force causes it to accelerate.
Yeah. F equals ma. Yeah. So if you've got an accelerated mass.
So here we go. Force is equal to mass times.
I have to intersect, guys. It's supposed to be question, silence, answer. Question, silence, answer. I don't want it to be a debate. You know, if you can literally hold fire till the question's answered and then the response is answered.
Right. So you asked me. Okay, you go ahead.
So if a mass accelerates, do you agree that means a force is making it accelerate?
Correct. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So how does gravity accelerate a mass when it isn't a force?
It is a force.
By the current citation of Einstein in his theory of general relativity, he says it's the effect of the curvature of space-time.
Yeah, I explained to you, I thought at some length, that gravity has there's two meanings to gravity. One is the bending of space-time, and the other one, just like the electrostatic thing, you can regard gravity as like the word electrostatics. And then we talk about the electrostatic force, we can talk about the gravitational force. And as Musa explained here, and as Jolin Bloomfield in his article here says, it is a generalized kind of force. In our 3D world, the bending of space-time, as is said here, as in the article you've often quoted, says that it is a generalized kind of force as a result of space-time. In our 3D world, the 4D world of space-time, the bending of it generates a 3D manifestation of a force, which we call gravity.
So when it says there in your letters, it says, to summarize, general relativity says the matter bends space-time, and the effect of that bending of space-time is to create a generalized kind of force that acts on objects. So is a generalized kind of force a force or not a force?
It's a force.
So why don't they just use the word to create a force?
Sorry, I missed that last bit.
So if it's a force, why don't they use the word to create a force?
Because it's an apparent force. It's like centrifugal force. It's an apparent force. It's the manifestation of this bending of space-time. So it's a geodesic thing. It's not like a sort of the force between a positive and negative charge. It's an apparent force, rather like centrifugal force is a force. It's an apparent force. So the apparent forces act just like normal forces, but we call them apparent because of their because they come from a slightly different source.
Yeah, so with the centrifugal force, it looks like there's a force pushing the object to the outside edge of the spinning disc, but the spinning disc is the real cause for it, isn't it?
The fact you're spinning is indeed the cause, and you do in the reference frame, like in a car when it goes around a bend, you would feel a force in that reference frame that pushes you into the door, and we call that an apparent force, just like we call gravity an apparent force. And that's why they Jolin has qualified his statement here by calling it a generalized kind of force. That's why it's not like a positive negative attraction force.
But when we looked at the definition of force, it was defined as an interaction between the two bodies. But if there's no interaction between the bodies and it's an apparent force, then it can't be by definition a force, can it?
Yes, I mean that definition is probably. I think if someone were to look at other issues, they'd probably try and remind me again. What was the exact wording? An interaction. Well, no, you see, that's someone who's struggling to determine what a force is, but by an interaction. We have all these other centrifugal forces, for instance, are not an interaction between bodies, but
exactly,
it is.
That's why they're not a force.
And it is a force. Centrifugal is a force. That's what you'd feel. You feel pressed into the door with a force.
No, it's not.
It is. It's a force.
Can you be more? Hold on, guys. Can you be more concise with your questioning there, Tony? It's no good just saying yes, it is, no, it isn't. Yes, it is, no, it isn't. You know.
Well.
I could put a force meter on the door of the car which is doing a turn, and it would register a real force.
Now, what would be the interacting body that would register the force?
Well, you need a force meter. So if you put a force meter in a car as you're going around a bend, and as you were forced into the door, it would show you like a scale, the equivalent of a scale, a force meter, which is what scales are. It would show you there was an actual force there.
Okay, so one of the definitions of force that I cited before states a force is a push or a pull upon an object resulting from the object's interaction with another object. So in the case of a car, where you have going round a roundabout and you have your scales the way you just described it, what would be the interaction?
Well, you would be accelerated into. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah, but what's? Oh, so the human would be the interaction.
Well, you would be pressing on it mechanically. So that's the interaction between you and the door on the force meter. A mechanical interaction.
But how is the human interacting with the car to create the force when there's no interaction there's no force there?
There is a force there. You can measure it with a force meter.
I need to intersect here, guys. Tony, could your line of questioning be a little more open and closed, where you give the answers and ask Rumpus to actually give a choice? Because what you're doing at the minute is you're offering Rumpus a chance to respond without giving it, and he's going around the same stuff that he's done for quite a while.
There's no interaction between the human and the car with centrifugal force, because centrifugal force is an apparent force. Correct, Rumpus?
That's correct, but you can register that force. That's why the definition you've got for force is wrong, really.
I gave 3.
Well, the one about interaction, that isn't completely correct, as the centrifugal force, which is a force, although it's an apparent force, demonstrates.
Okay, so back to the original assertion. You claim that the scales are a force measuring device. You also claim that mass is not a force, but weight is a force.
Correct.
I've said that the current science is from Einstein, who says it's not a force, and George Musa, in his interview with Fight the Flat Earth, did say that there was no interaction, there was nothing reaching out from the Earth to the Moon in the context of gravitation.
That's correct.
You remember him saying that, right?
Yes, and it's correct.
Excellent. So if there's nothing reaching out from the Earth to the Moon, what makes you think there'd be something reaching out from the Earth to the mass of the object standing on the scales?
There is nothing reaching out.
Right. So it can't be a force, can it?
Yes, it can.
Right.
There does not have to be a reaching out. There does not have to be a reaching out from the Earth to the Moon or to you in some sort of
has to be an
electrostatic-like interaction. There doesn't have to be one for there to be a force.
Yeah, there has to be an interaction between the bodies, and we know there is.
You can measure the force.
Said so.
Well, you can show the scales can demonstrate there is a force then, and Einstein says there isn't an interaction, and we all agree on that. So does Musser, as he states, and there is a force demonstrated.
So then, if you agree with Einstein, and that there isn't a force reaching out to the object, the human that stood on the scales,
right,
that means you haven't got the little g, the downwards acceleration due to Earth's gravity, because it isn't pulling down on the person. Which leads me back to my question, what are the scales measuring if mass is not a force and weight is a force, but you can't have little g in your calculations because Einstein said it's not a force?
Yes, we talk about the force of gravity, as I explained to you earlier. There's gravity, in the sense of the umbrella term, and then there's the force of gravity, which is the result of the bending of space-time, and that we can measure with a force meter-like scales.
So how does the bending of space-time influence the weight, the human that stood on the scales?
Well, this manifestation of a force in our 3D world as a result of the bending of space-time is this result of Einstein's field equations, which are very complicated, and how that reduces to the Newtonian simple case is a intensely mathematical process that you would have difficulty understanding.
So what's the number on the scales when the person stands on it? What's it measuring then? Is it measuring mass?
It's measuring the force
weight?
of gravity. It's measuring your weight. It's measuring a force. We've established that's what scales do, because the scales move. Therefore, they have to be, to something to move, there has to be a force acting on them. So the scales must have a force acting on them. So we know for a fact there's a force there. We call that force your weight. And when Einstein has provided the equations which go from 4D bending of space-time, and they manifest themselves in our 3D world as a force, as measured by some scales.
But we know that it's the effect of the curve.
Correct.
It's space-time and not a force.
That isn't a force. It manifests itself as a force.
So the scales cannot be measuring the weight, then, can they?
They can, because it's the bending of space-time manifests itself in Einstein's equations as a force in our 3D world.
But it's the effect of the curvature of space-time, not a force.
Correct. No, this is. It manifests itself as a result of the bend. The effect of the bending of space-time is to manifest itself as a force in our 3D world.
So my final closing question was, if scales are a force measuring device, I'm pointing out to the audience that you're saying that either Einstein's wrong, but you've just agreed that he's right, or that mass must be a force because there is a measurement of something, and you say that that's not right. So the only thing that we're left with is that scales are not measuring a force at all, which seems preposterous given that they are putting a number. There is a number on there when someone gets on it. How is it possible that you're in a state of current science?
I'm absolutely agreeing with the current science. Your three options are just wrong. I've explained to you that Einstein is not disagreeing with Newton. Newton's equations can be derived from Einstein's equations. He's completely in agreement with Newton.
Okay, so that my closing statement for the prosecution's case against the Rumpus is that he still is in a state of contradiction. He will not accept that gravitation is not a force, although the scales are measuring something, and we do see a mass on the scales. Einstein said it's not a force, and we also know that...
He didn't say that.
Yeah, he did. Literally, gravity is not a force. It is the effect of the curvature of space-time. That's his theory.
Can you see the quote on screen where George Musser, who lectures in this subject, says, I'm perfectly happy to describe, and I do describe gravity as a force, and I do describe electricity, electrical forces.
Yes, but George Musser is a theoretical scientist that doesn't engage in experimentation.
As was Einstein.
Which by definition makes them both pseudoscientists.
Right, so you are trying to invalidate Einstein as well, then?
Not really. I'm just pointing out that you're in contradiction from the current science.
I'm in complete agreement with Musser, I'm completely in agreement with Einstein, and I'm completely in agreement with Newton.
Okay, so my closing statement is that Rumpus still lies in a state of contradiction because mass is not a force, weight is a force, but we know that great weight is subject to little g, the acceleration due to gravity, which we know is not a force. We do accept that there's something being demonstrated on the scales, and there is a mass on the scales. We know that weight's not a force. Rumpus is still in contradiction by current science, and he has to basically make it sound like he's not. but it's up to
not.
the audience and Ranty to decide whether or not he's in contradiction or not. He's clearly in contradiction.
No, you've just made stuff up there. It's completely incorrect what you've just said. I've demonstrated I'm in agreement with George Musser, Einstein, Newton. I've demonstrated the scales are a force. You said little g is a force. It isn't. It's an acceleration. You don't understand what you're talking about.
Little g is an acceleration due to the gravitation of the Earth, right?
It's not a force.
But we know that it's not a force, yeah. So it can't accelerate anything.
No, little g is an acceleration. It's not a force.
Due to the Earth's gravitational pull.
You keep on calling it a force. It's not a force. It's an acceleration. That's like saying velocity is the same as acceleration. It's not. Acceleration is not the same as a force.
If a mass accelerates, by definition, it's a force.
No. Acceleration is an acceleration. Like velocity is velocity. Force is not the same thing as acceleration. You don't understand what F is equal to ma is. You don't understand the difference between an acceleration and a force, even though I've explained it in one of my pages there, exactly what the force is equal to ma, the difference between a force and acceleration. You don't understand force is equal to ma.
Francie, I've made my case against the Rumpus. He still stands in a case of contradiction.
No,
either the scales are measuring mass as a force, or scales are not a force measuring device at all, or Einstein was wrong and gravity is actually pulling down on the mass on the scales after all. But either way, Rumpus is still in a state of contradiction.
I'm in agreement with George Musser and the mainstream science. You don't understand it.
If I was to rule so far, it would be that it's still up for debate. It doesn't seem like anybody's won this particular argument. Just saying, Tony, I think you missed your opportunity to ask some closed questions. You spent most of the debate sort of asking Rumpus to explain stuff when it should have been a lot more closed questions. Would you agree?
It doesn't matter. I think it's down to the audience to decide myself. But
I do too. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, you've done some. There's some good questions there, and Rumpus has defended himself just as equally. You know, I mean, I just don't think it's really progressed anything at the moment. I mean, if you want to try do a recess and come back again, I'm happy to do a quick 5-minute recess.
No, I'm good. I think that he's still in a state of contradiction. If you don't see that, then that's up to you. But
you don't understand what you're talking about. Is the problem?
Well, that's up to you to argue, isn't it? And if you think that,
well, I've demonstrated it. You don't understand the difference between force and acceleration. You didn't understand that Einstein, and you don't agree with George Musser or the Jolin guy that you've quoted, who agrees and says he uses the force. Mainstream science agrees with me. You're the one who's got the problem. Sorry?
I haven't quoted Jolien. That's a red herring point. I did not mention Jolien at all.
No, but you have in the past, and I'm just demonstrating I'm in agreement with him, and I'm in agreement with Musser, and I'm in agreement with Einstein, and I'm in agreement with mainstream science, and you don't understand the difference between force and acceleration.
So let's just conclude, Rumpus. You think that the force that the scales are measuring is the weight of the mass on the object, on the scales. Correct. And we know that the mass is a measuring device of the scalar, but we know that weight doesn't have...
Mass is a measuring device.
Yeah,
so that's making... Mass is a measuring device.
Well, if you think that you're not in contradiction, I don't know how else to explain it to you.
Well, you don't understand. That's the problem. You don't understand that gravity. There's a force of gravity, and there's the gravity refers to the bending of space-time. You don't understand the difference between those two things, and you don't seem to be accepting what Musser said.
And you're still in contradiction.
No, I haven't contradicted anything.
You are. You're still in a state of contradiction.
No, you're just making it up. It is
Gravity's not a force, mate. It can't pull down on the
This is what George Musser on screen says. I'm perfectly happy to describe, and I do describe gravity as a force. Same thing with Jolin Bloomfield. It's a generalized kind of force. You're just disagreeing with established mainstream science.
I think
gravity's not a force. Can't pull down.
As the layperson here, if you're just listening, if somebody said it's a generalized kind of thing, you wouldn't attribute it to being an actual thing.
Yes, you would. If you got a brain, you would. It's a kind of force, like a kind of zebra, a kind of lion is a lion, a kind of car, a Rolls Royce is a kind of car. It's a car. Anybody who can understand English would recognise that means it is a force. It's a type of force.
Yeah, but you could equally say You could equally say a fox is a kind of dog if you didn't know what it was.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't a kind of
It's
dog.
a cat. Yeah, if you was trying to explain it, it's a kind of dog, kind of
No,
cat,
it's not.
kind
No,
of.
it's not a kind of. No, it's not a
And
kind
no,
of.
we
dog or
know
kind
that.
of
Yeah,
cat.
we know that. We
No,
know
that'd be an
that.
incorrect
But if you're trying to
statement.
explain, so saying it's a kind of something.
No, you would. You've made a series of kinds which are incorrect, and I've used the one correctly, where something is a kind. A car is a Rolls Royce is a kind of car. Zebra is a kind of mammal. That's how it's being used there. I mean, it's just basic English here.
I disagree. I think
Yeah.
if it was
Perhaps
written,
a type of force. Perhaps the word type would help you out. It's a generalised type of force.
if it was a force, you would expect it to be written as a force rather than a kind of force.
It is a
And I
kind
think
of
that's the
Magnetism is a kind of force. The magnetic force is a kind of force. The electrostatic force is a kind of force. Gravitational force.
But it's
is a
not
kind
written
of
that.
force.
It's not written that. You don't find citations of it written like that. But
Well,
when
we have
you
got one here.
Ranty, you've missed a
go ahead.
super chat.
Oh right,
You've missed a
okay.
super chat.
Yeah. There was a couple actually. There was let's see. So we've had a super chat from Jimbo Con. I know it's not big numbers, but it's just for a lowly house painter. Please keep up the good work. Space-time bending doesn't happen here on Earth. And from JQ, who says it's game, set, and match to Anthony. But yeah, just carrying on this one point is that if you look for, what did you cite just before, electrostatics or something like that?
Yeah, it's electrostatic force. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not a description as it's a kind of, So this is what we're
Well,
saying.
to be honest, that's the first time. I mean, just for the benefit of the audience, everybody in the audience should be aware that Rumpus did have pre-advanced disclosure of my points in full. He knew exactly what I was going to say to him. There wasn't any sneaky unprepared. He knew all about this, and I did not know what his counters were going to be. If I did know his counters were going to include electrostatics as gravitation, I'd have come up with. Well, basically, he's never argued this position before for gravity.
I have. If you haven't been listening, I've repeatedly
It's the first
used
time
this
I've ever heard him use.
Well, that's your problem.
I've never heard Rumpus. Ranty, off topic. Have you ever heard Rumpus refer to gravity as an electrostatic effect?
No, I've never. Hold on. I never said that. What are you? God, you misunderstood. I didn't say that. I said I was explaining to you that just as we talk about electrostatics and we can't just say the force. Electrostatics is not a force. We talk about the electrostatic force. Similarly, we talk about gravity and the gravitational force.
Well,
I've
I'm
never
gonna listen back to
ever
that
said
part.
that gravity was an electrostatic force.
I'm going to listen back to that part because the way you described that portion of it, I've never heard you refer to gravity in that context ever before. I'm sure Ranty would agree with me.
He said it was when he was trying to explain a kind of something. He said you wouldn't explain magnetism as a kind of magnetism or something like that. That's how it was phrased. So he didn't actually specifically link it to gravity. It was just we were trying to decipher what it was meant by a kind of. And I was trying to say that. So we've got hang on. Whilst we're on this, we got a shout out from JQ who says a shout out, a super chat. Rumpus is a kind of retard.
But you're a kind of retard, though, Ranty, because you're a flat earther.
Well, hang on. Whatever it was that you actually referenced in that context, Rumpus, and I may have misheard you at the time, because like I said, it was the first time. I've not heard Rumpus's response, his rebuttal, but he has heard my case against him, so he was able to hone his specific arguments.
I wouldn't have changed. You didn't change any point.
Yeah, but my point was...
all these arguments I've used before.
But my point was that you got the prep time that you needed to address the points that were being made. I didn't get that back. Not that I'm complaining. I'm just saying that's why I didn't catch the electrostatic bit properly, because I've never heard it before. And if I did hear that before and I knew that's what you were going to say, I would have looked at that and challenged what you actually said, because I couldn't respond to that because it's the first time I've ever heard you mention it in that context.
No, well, okay, you've missed out. I've used it, but I didn't feature it in my. I didn't actually have any text to that effect. I was just they did that verbally to describe it, because you've got this issue. You don't understand that gravity is a mere word with several meanings, just like there are other words with several meanings.
Well, anyway, regardless of which meaning you pick for today, I think that overall this style is a lot better, because we do have the ability to get some points made, and in future, if this style works, then this might actually be good for everybody because it does seem to work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree, but what I would say for going forward is that it needs to be a little more open and closed. What you allow when you give an open response, you allow the person in the dock to have an open response.
Most questions are open, ranty in a court. They're not all. Why you seem to think they're only closed questions is ridiculous.
Well, I think because the lines are drawn, so we already know the arguments for the globe, and quite often the arguments.
You don't understand them, though, do you?
Let me finish. Quite often you know the arguments for the flat, so essentially we know what's going to be said. So it's not like we're expecting anything new. So when it comes to this kind of format, I would hope that the barrister, in this case Tony, could have perhaps been a little more open and just asking closed questions. That's.
Yeah, you've got a strange idea what a court is. Now I appreciate you want to try and protect Anthony now because I've demonstrated that I'm right and he's wrong, and you're finding that difficult to deal with.
Not the case.
I appreciate that.
I think the argument,
and you're trying to protect him, but I'm afraid it's too bad, Ranty. I've won this game, set, and match.
I think the argument is more to do with the phrasing of a kind of. I think it all stems back to that. The definition itself needs to be determined. If you can determine that, perhaps get in touch with the people would be my suggestion.
I've got in touch with Jolin and he's talking to me.
Okay, so is he going to update his website or something like that with his specific
I will
quote?
ask him. I will ask him for further clarification. He'll just tell me. I'm quite sure that just like a Rolls Royce is a kind of car, and a fox is a kind of mammal, gravitational force is a kind of force.
It's not. You can think of it as a force, but they still don't make it a force.
Mercer says so, and the Jolin does says so. Other people.
Yeah, but if gravity's not a force, but you can think like it's a force, I've got a car, right? And no matter how much I think of it as a Ferrari, don't make it a Ferrari. But I can think of it as a Ferrari.
Yeah, but did you see what the quote there says? He says, the Musser quote, my thing's not scrolling for some reason, come bloody thing. He says, I've referred to it, here we go, I'm perfectly happy to describe, and I do describe gravity as a force.
Yeah, as a force, not a force. As a force. I'll describe my car as a Ferrari from now on if
Yeah, but it wouldn't be right, though. This is valid.
Horrible.
Yeah, but he's saying he's happy to describe it as a force, so he's saying it's a force.
Yeah, but he knows it's the effect of. He knows it's the effect of the curvature of space-time, but he's happy to describe it as a force.
Yes, because he's referring to the force of gravity in our 3D world, and then there's the gravity which we talk about as being bending space-time. And he says here, I'm perfectly happy to describe, and I do describe gravity as a force.
It's all right, Ranty, I'm going to have to go and park my Ferrari back into the garage. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
I don't have a Ferrari, but you can think of it as a Ferrari.
We had a super chat from Trish who says Sleeping Warrior won and Rumpus is held in contempt. And we also had...
Someone hasn't been listening.
We had another one. They are closed questions in court, again from Trish. Get me to formulate the questions and Rumpus wouldn't get out alive. So, yeah, I mean, like I say, I think the opportunity to maybe do a little more research. What I've found in this particular session right now is that it does, in my opinion, come down to this phrasing of that term, what a kind of force means.
Musser says he's perfectly happy to describe gravity as force. Have you not?
And
I've now repeated that about 5 times. You seem to be ignoring it.
No, I'm happy to describe my car as a Ferrari.
You'd be wrong, though.
Right, and so would he.
No, Musser's right.
No,
he knows
not.
what he's talking about,
listen, Rumpus,
Anthony.
The effect of the curvature of space-time, even if he wants it and demands that it is a force, is not a force.
It is
even
a force.
if you think of it as a force, it isn't.
He
one. We all understand
this,
that.
Anthony. He understands this. He lectures in this.
We all understand what it means when he says
it.
Gravity is not a force. Rumpus, his words are, gravity is not a force, but you can think of it as a force. Well, that don't make it a force. We all understand that.
He says here he's perfectly happy to describe it as refer to it as a force.
Yeah, so, we all understand that doesn't make it a force.
It is a force, and also Jolin also said
no
it was
interaction.
A force.
It lacks the interaction bit, Rumpus, by definition.
No, that's the definition you've got. That's an incorrect definition.
Like I said, you can go and find those forces. That's why I got 3 of them because I didn't want to be accused of cherry picking them. But you can go and find the definition of force, and they all state pretty much the same thing. There's got to be something between the two objects pushing
Well,
or
in which
pulling.
case, centrifugal force, which you can measure
Which
with a
isn't a
force
force,
device.
that's why it's
Yes,
not
it
called
is
a
though.
force.
If you go and you can measure the force with a force meter inside your car if you want to, and demonstrate that it's a real thing.
It's not. That's why they don't call it a
So you
real
don't think the force meter, you would register a force inside a car as you turn then?
Michael Cox, you don't spell lose L-O-O-S-E. That's loose, you moron. It's lose L-O-S-E. Anyway.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway,
So,
Ranty, I think if this style works, I think that this is successful regardless of the outcome. I think that this is the only way really to have the back and forth and get to a point where the conclusion can be made. But what I would say is when I gave Rumpus the advanced disclosure so he knew what I was going to say, it works the other way too, really. I think the other person should then show back what they're going to say back. And then the only bit that's really ad hoc is the bit where you have the back and forth questions at the end, because that way it's like narrowing the issues.
But
we both know what each
the
other's
thing
gonna
is,
say
you're making the charge, and therefore it is usual for me to therefore see that information. If you want a debate in which you're just simply giving 2 presentations, then that's a different thing. And then
but if you would have given me the rebuttal that you were going to rebut with, then that would have made me be more able to narrow the points without me having to do it on the fly and like ad hoc. That would have.
I agree. Yes, I mean, but the points I'm making here, I've not modified actually for your thing. I haven't changed any of my arguments here that I've used before.
I think
my point was that if I'd have had the rebuttal back, that would have been better.
Going forward, I think
I agree with you, Anthony, actually. I mean, to some extent, although this format, it requires you to do what you've done, but if you went for another format, then yes, if you were to present me with your argument, then it's only reasonable for me to present you with mine. But this format isn't quite that symmetrical thing here, is it? But I would agree with you in principle. If you're going to show me what your good arguments make, in principle, you should see my arguments as well. But the point was, I'm responding to your arguments. It's not. I mean, if you wanted to see what I'm doing, I might go on about something that's complete. You're making you've set the agenda, you've set the discussion here. I haven't. If I was going to start being allowed to make my own presentation, then it would be on a different subject. But I've allowed you to pick the subject, and we focused entirely on the thing that you wanted to focus on.
You've not allowed me to pick. That's the whole point of the summary.
We have.
Isn't it?
You've picked the subject. You've set what the whole thing's about. The scales are not force measuring devices.
Yeah, but that's the point
You've
of
set
the
the
summary,
whole
isn't it?
argument here, and I've had to respond to that. I haven't been able to talk about anything else except that was relevant to your charge.
No,
So
but you're free to challenge Nathan or Ranty on something that you know.
Oh yeah, but in this particular situation, we're dealing with what's happening now, and that's you've set the agenda here.
I think
I've responded.
I think once the style starts narrowing down and people get to understand how it generally works, I think people will understand what they can and can't do and how it works, and I think it'll work better with more time being spent.
I absolutely agree. I think what's happened today has been a good first show. You know, there's clearly a lot of tweaks that need to go on. You know, there's a lot of things that I've learned, a lot of things that you guys have learned. I mean, even just getting what the responses are going to be prior might be worthwhile. I'm also thinking about having guest judges as well, so it's not just going to be me all the time. So I'm hoping at some point, I'm thinking maybe if it's the globe put on trial, to actually have a globe earther sat in the chair, simply because I don't want it to feel unbiased or biased in any way. I don't think I'm biased, but in case I get accused of being biased, it's just something I'm thinking of. So, you know, if you guys agree with that, let me know. Jimbo Con says it's not interaction if it's one object always going down. And Gleam says a similar thing. Now the centrifugal force is the reactionary force of the real centrifugal force of the turn of the opposite direction. It's the same force, just a different frame. What do you think of that?
It's gibberish. I mean, well, it's half gibberish. If someone clearly doesn't understand the equations, I mean, I can go in. I've got another presentation I can make on centripetal and centrifugal force, but it wouldn't. I mean, I can bring that up if you like, and I could go into very considerable detail if you want me to, but it would take about 10 minutes to explain it fully.
Yeah, maybe not today. Maybe on another show. But this is the format. This is sort of like a different format as opposed to the debates and the presentations and the stuff. It's something that I just want for one person to take another person to court and specifically challenge them on one topic. So, like today, it's a very tough subject to talk about, especially when you've got a quotation that's as ambiguous as the one that we're trying to decipher here.
Several quotations I provided.
Which is a kind of force. Um,
And I provide another one which talked about a generalised kind of force, and the fact that he's also happy to describe it as a force. I gave several quotations in which two people described it as a force. There was only one with a kind of force, but Musa was more explicit and saying that he was happy to say it's a force.
So, going ahead, obviously, I would. We could start on easier things. I think this was a very tough subject to get stuck into straight away, Tony. I do appreciate you bringing the Rumpus to court. It would have been interesting if you'd perhaps had a couple of citations directly from the persons involved with this kind of thing.
Well, I never cited any people, but what I would say is that it was more of a test, like just to see whether or not it would work. But I didn't bring up citations from Musa. He brought them up. I didn't know he was bringing them up, did I?
You set the agenda. You set the subject matter. You picked it as your strong area of discussion, strong area where you felt you could make a strong case. And you've allowed to. You have picked your very own favourite pet subject with which you feel confident, and I've rebutted it.
Sure. But my point is that I didn't know what your rebuttals were going to be, and if I'm to be criticised for not addressing the quotes, then I didn't know that you were going to bring them quotes up, did I? That's all I'm saying. If I'd have known that, I could have done.
Well, hang on. I think the format just going forward, in my own opinion, from sitting here listening to what I heard, was that there was a lot of very open questions that were allowed to just take away.
What is the objection if you got to open questions? That happens, in a court, Ranty.
Yes, I know.
Jesus Christ. Well, you seem to be trying to cover up Anthony's arse because you didn't like the fact that I've sorted him out. And therefore you think, you're trying to say, effectively saying you want to censor me.
Rumpus,
no, not
Rumpus,
at all.
You didn't sort
not
me out, but you can think of it that you sorted me out.
It's quite apparent to everybody that's what's happened.
I just think I just think Tony went very easy on you for the first show, which I appreciate actually, because I didn't actually feel that we want to have an argument here.
Actually, I have to say, I thought Anthony was very well behaved.
Indeed.
Unusually,
except for the fact that he didn't understand what I was saying, but I don't blame him for not
Rumpus,
being
don't spoil it. I was going to say the same back, Rumpus. You were really well behaved, and it works. That works. Well, except for the fact that you were wrong.
I'll tell you what will happen then. I'll do it. I'll obviously need to review this. Go through, do a few tweaks. I think it went well. I was pleased with what we did. Going forward, I would hope there would be a lot of other subjects that we can get into. Maybe change a few things. Like I said,
let me give you some feedback, Ranty.
Okay.
When you are in real world court, I'm the one that's making my case, and what I've got to try and do is persuade the judge that my case is right. And what the judge doesn't do is doesn't just sit there and listen. They'll argue back and they'll challenge and they'll say, but what is your case then? Can you be clear on this? And they'll challenge it so that if you came to the topic and you knew nothing about it, the judge would end up knowing most of the arguments by challenging critically the application by the claimant. So what I mean is, if I was to be critical against you, what I would say is that you need to engage the lead case, the prosecuting case, so that you know that they are making a good, strong case. And if you felt that there were any areas that weren't particularly clear or strong, you challenge them, because I've got to persuade the judge that I'm right. And the judge isn't always just going to sit there and, they're never going to sit there and just listen to you. They will challenge you because it's for you to prove your case, isn't it?
Well,
or me to prove mine.
Yeah, having a fairly decent grasp of English, if I was being that ruthless of a judge, I would definitely have thrown out those sort of, it's a sort of gravity, They would have definitely gone, because that to me isn't concrete proof. But there we go.
Well, equally, they would challenge the...
You don't understand half the things I'm talking about, so...
Yeah, but equally, Rumpus, the judge would also say, in response to challenging me, they would also challenge you as well and say, well, the question against you is this, stay on topic kind of thing. So the judge leads the proceedings.
I did. Stay on topic.
Well, anyway, it was good. It was good. And I think that it was productive. And I think that as time goes by, you get 2 or 3 more under your belt, and then people get to understand what's expected and how it's going to work and that kind of stuff. And then I think that'll probably work.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, first time in the hot seat. First I did say it would be more of a trial and error on the first one. So yeah, I'm pleased. We've had nearly 150 people watching. Can't be bad. Can't be bad for the first show.
Right, it's midnight, boys and girls. I'm off to bed.
Right, Rumpus. Right, Riley. both of you, thanks for turning up. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Rumpus. You were a good sport.
Okay, you two are actually quite well behaved. Yep.
Quite well behaved.
I'll speak to you both in a bit.
Laters.
Right, guys, thanks very much. Few tweaks here and there. If you want to leave any comments, by all means, just leave some comments after this has finished uploading, and we'll take it from there. We'll see where we can make some changes. Maybe a little more toast to the fire. I would have preferred a little more toast to the fire, but yeah, we'll work on that. Right, that's me. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody that gave a super chat. I do appreciate it. I think I read all your super chats out, which is something I always try to do. The chat's been quite civil as well, I have to say, and it was nice to see the Rumpus in and didn't actually lose his rag for a change, which was something I did specify to him quite a lot in the Skype before we actually went live. So well behaved. Right, that'll do for now. What day are we today? It's Monday, isn't it? So it's Monday. So yeah, probably, I don't know, Wednesday, I would hope, maybe with a presentation. Who knows? I'll let you know on the day. In the meantime, thanks for stopping by. This is the end of the Roundtable Court episode 1, and we will see you all in the next one.